China is in a lot of turmoil, and we all know it at this point because it's been a long time coming. A recession is now finally on the cards for that massive country. There is a property market collapse that gets worse every single day. There's still zero COVID madness going on, crippling the country. And the Communist Party is intent on destroying any businesses which survive those other problems. This is all taking its toll on the country and its economy as a whole, and last week was, of course, no different. Of course, it all got worse once more with another massive shock to the property market, with more examples of the Communist Party taking over and increasing their authority, and a whole lot of other things as well. We probably then ought to start with the property market because that's where this entire economic collapse is really stemming from, so it only makes sense. Now, Country Garden is the biggest singular property developer in China and actually in the world as well, with millions of direct and indirect employees. Every year, they build hundreds of thousands of individual homes in China, and of course, they have billions of dollars worth of debt and liabilities that are building up too. Now, for the best part of a year, as the Evergrande crisis and the property developer crisis really started to explode, Country Garden mostly found itself insulated from those problems. They were far less over-levered than their competitors, but they still had too much debt, and these problems were always going to come for Country Garden as well, just later on in that point in the cycle, and we are now finally at that point. Last week, Country Garden came out and announced that they have seen a 70% drop in their quarterly profits over the first half of 2022. Now, that is a massive hit to their bottom line. And of course, that is only over the first half of this year. And as the property market continues to crash, with property prices falling every single time we get new data, it's very likely that Country Garden will do even worse in the second half of this year. As I said, they are the biggest property developer in the world and one of China's biggest companies in the entire country as well. And they only saw $700 million worth of profit across the first 2 quarters of this year. Go back just over a year and a half and the company was valued at 70 billion US dollars, and now their share price has fallen by 85% to where it is today. We also just saw the company get all of its debt, all of its company bonds downgraded to junk level by Fitch Ratings. There is now not a single piece of debt that this company has given out that is investment grade, and yields are sky high at 47% right now. That is how bad markets are expecting this collapse to get for Country Garden. They are almost guaranteeing that the company will default. There are so few investors willing to buy this debt from this company that the yield has soared to 47%. Now, this is a massive problem for the property sector as a whole and for China's economy as a whole too, because Country Garden is like the Apple or Microsoft of this entire industry. It's supposed to be a blue chip safe haven investment. Its corporate bonds are supposed to be investment grade and really secure for innocent Chinese investors to put their money into, but they are now borderline worthless. This quote from this article here sums it up quite nicely. Country Garden was suffering from worsening investor sentiment towards the sector. There are fears of falling prices as demand wanes and new apartments remain uncompleted, with cash-strapped developers running out of money. Now, even Country Garden couldn't basically proceed with pre-sales for new projects because the contagion is so extreme. Now, it does now seem that the Chinese government is finally realizing just how dire this situation is, and they might be finally starting to act to try and prop up the property development sector, and they might even be going in the direction of a bailout. Over just the course of one singular week, the Chinese authorities have decided to cut 2 separate interest rates by a fair amount. The first is the 5-year loan rate, which has been cut from 4.45% to 4.3%. And then just earlier today, they then proceeded to cut the 1-year loan rate from 3.7% to 3.65%. The Communist Party is trying to make loans more attractive to their consumers in their country. They're trying to get people to take out more debt and to spend it to stimulate the economy. The problem is that this doesn't really seem to be working because the Chinese people are shunning any kind of debt right now. They are absolutely terrified of taking out more debt because of how poor the economy is looking. So it's actually highly unlikely that these rate cuts will do anything to stop this economic collapse. There is, though, one policy decision that the Communist Party might be doing that could actually make a difference. But I do have to stress here that this is, for the moment, really just rumors. And these rumors are that the Communist Party might be putting out some new state-backed bonds for these property developers. It should be clear at this point that these property developers, Country Garden and Evergrande included, are going to die without fresh capital to pay off their debt. Country Garden's bond yields, as I said earlier, were sitting at 47% yields. And of course, it's worse for every other company out there because they are even weaker. Developers just can't raise any cash right now, and so they're destined to all collapse. The CCP, though, might put into place this new rules which would allow them to back personally those bonds, to guarantee them, which would allow for far lower yields and far cheaper debt, which could be a lifeline for these property developers. There is, of course, a problem with this policy, though. This basically just amounts to state bailouts, because when these companies fail to repay these new bonds, which they will, of course, fail to pay, the Communist Party will simply have to pay them instead. This is an intensely unpopular idea across China because the Communist Party has rallied against capitalism for years. They have rallied against the idea that some banks and institutions are too big to fail. They've told their citizens that that's the evil stuff that only happens over in America and could never happen in China. Now they're looking like they have to do it themselves. It will be insanely unpopular, not to mention insanely costly for the Communist Party and the state as a whole too. Either way, this will not be an easy decision. We're still not 100% sure whether the CCP will go down this road. And then even if they do, there's still the chance that this wouldn't stop the property market crash as a whole either. Because at the end of the day, the only real way that this property market collapse stops is if people start buying homes again, which at the moment doesn't look very likely. The problems don't stop there though, because there's another massive issue across China, and this one is also entirely self-inflicted. This is about the Communist Party and its increasing authority killing good businesses. The first big news regarding this is about Tencent, which is one of the biggest, most successful Chinese companies ever in history, and they are selling their Meituan stake. Now, Meituan is basically an e-commerce store and system for buying and selling and doing a bunch of other services like logistics, delivery, travel, and some other things too across China. Tencent's stake in this company is worth about $24 billion, and Tencent has also recently sold off shares in other companies like JD.com and SEC. Now, why are they doing this? Well, because the Communist Party over recent years has been worried at how powerful big Chinese tech companies are getting, and so they've started to attack them with needless fines and a bunch of random regulations. Tencent is of course no newcomer to that world, and they're trying to placate the CCP in advance by reducing their own influence willingly. They're selling shares of other companies that they own, hoping that the Communist Party will then recognize that they aren't as powerful as they could have been, and they will then leave them alone. There is, though, an overarching problem with this idea, though, and what will happen as a result. This will massively reduce the capital investment in China. Businesses are basically scared of being too successful. China's already struggling to get any kind of capital inflows from abroad because the Communist Party has already allowed property developers to default on their offshore bonds with absolutely no consequences, which has cost foreign investors billions of dollars already. This really is another example of the slow but steady death of capitalism in China, and this will, in the long run, be absolutely devastating for the Chinese economy. Tencent selling their Meituan stake is just one small example. Of course, that isn't the only example there, because in the world of the Communist Party wanting more control and authority, there are more brand new developments as well. This one in particular is about Alibaba and ByteDance, who have shared details of their algorithms with the Communist Party for the first time in history. This gives the CCP an insight into how the businesses actually work, and it also gives the CCP more control and the ability to take over and change things about their algorithms if they want. This represents the further centralization of CCP power across the country as a whole, and this will lead to the exact same problems as we just discussed with Tencent and that Meituan problem. There is one other massive issue from this change though, one that can't be ignored at all. ByteDance own TikTok, which is a massive app, I'm sure you know, and it's especially huge in the West and the US in particular. To make matters worse, ByteDance is already suspected of sharing data on American and Western citizens with the Communist Party, and the fact that ByteDance is now willingly showing their algorithms to the Communist Party makes that idea that they're sharing their data as well even more unlikely. This will have massive impacts on tensions and relations between East and West. Now, the problems with China and the US in particular should already be pretty obvious to you because it's been in the news every single day for the last few months. The most recent tipping point, though, is that Taiwan and the US are to hold certain trade talks, and China is absolutely furious. Now, the details of these trade talks really aren't too important, but basically, the US and Taiwan are strengthening their relations and getting closer, and that is what's important. The Communist Party simply doesn't want Taiwan recognized as a country, and this furthers the legitimization of Taiwan, and so of course they would never like this kind of thing. The US though are going to go right ahead with this idea anyway though, just like they did with Pelosi's trip to Taiwan a couple of weeks ago. This is yet another example of worsening tensions and bad relations between East and West that will only continue to get worse as we move forward. Now, this specific side, it does seem to be slightly US instigated, although it is in response to the Chinese rhetoric regarding invading Taiwan that they've been pushing recently. ByteDance sharing their data and their algorithms with the Communist Party, though, will certainly be Chinese instigated, and the US will not be happy and will likely retaliate at some point in the future. We've already seen TikTok almost being banned in the US in its entirety by Trump a couple of years ago, and it isn't off the cards at all for that to happen as we go forward. Now, these relations that keep getting worse between East and West are of course important for geopolitical reasons, but I hear it all the time. Max, this is a finance channel, so how will this impact financial markets? Well, chip makers is a brilliant example of just that impact. China, of course, produces an insane amount of the world's microchips and semiconductors, and they are incredibly important for Western economies, as you well know. It's then dangerous for the West then to have their supply chains so wound up in China in the case of war, and Western governments really do understand this. At the end of 2021, a South Korean chip maker which was planning a merger with a Chinese firm had it cancelled not by South Korean or Chinese authorities, but by American authorities, surprisingly enough. The entire chip maker and semiconductor industry is on a cliff edge right now because of tensions between East and West. Many firms simply really struggle to expand without mergers, and mergers with Chinese firms and even two Western firms are near impossible at this point because governments are so worried about national security. This will have wide-ranging consequences for this industry and thus the rest of the world's economy as well. This could extend the supply chain crisis for years to come. It could damage smaller chip makers and make it more difficult for them to expand in the future. And it could also make it far harder for larger chip manufacturers to expand through acquiring smaller firms. A great example of this was Nvidia's purchase of ARM, which is a British semiconductor manufacturer, which was cancelled last year because of national security concerns. This will affect share prices of these companies for decades into the future, and it will also have massive impacts into the supply of microchips in general. Finally, it really is worth mentioning as well that all of this chaos is happening at pretty much the worst possible time for Xi Jinping. He's currently preparing to try and secure a third term in charge of China. He's recently been embarrassed regarding Taiwan and the US. He's got a crashing housing market, an economy that is falling into recession by every day. There is civil unrest across the country, and he really isn't too popular right now. Yes, he's a dictator, but even dictators need supporters. There is a reason that oligarchs are so wealthy, and it's because their loyalty has been bought with billions of dollars. China is no different in that regard. It is certainly possible that Xi seeks some big rallying cry to unite everyone behind him. Many people are suggesting that a war would work. Personally, I don't really think China is really in any kind of position to actually invade Taiwan at this point, so I really hope it doesn't come to that. It is, though, certainly possible, and we all know that the Chinese Communist Party has done far worse things in the past. One final thing then, just before we sign off for the day, I have a new channel which is putting out documentaries every single week called Stoic Society. There will be a link down below in the description of the comments section for you. It's putting out really high quality pieces. They are really interesting. I think you'll all like them. So please go check that out. We just did one on free speech in the UK and why it's absolutely dead right now. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to bless the YouTube algorithm. It really does help. If you want to join our exclusive community, then check out our Patreon. You get access to our Discord server and extra content like access to my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. Thank you all for watching. Stay stoic. Until next time.